All right, guys, today we're going to talk about something that just needs to be said and people need to hear it. The Republican Party is not racist, has never been racist. I'm going to go back in time in a very brief manner and give some key points and key dates to expound that point. And the first part of this is not controversial. Everybody knows it. It's the interpretations of what happened and how everything switched that I'll talk about as well and kind of explain it. But everybody knows the Republican Party was started as an anti-slavery party. And then everybody knows that from like 1964 basically till today, 90% of blacks vote for Democrats. So why is that the case? So we're going to get into it right now. Several parties in America. Of course, you had the Federalist Party, the Whig Party, the Democratic Republicans. In the 1830s, really starting with Andrew Jackson, you had the current party that we have today getting started in the 1830s. It was a racist party for sure. From the South, really, representing the interests of the people who owned slaves. In the 1850s, the Republican Party was started. Basically, the Whig Party kind of split up. They couldn't agree on slavery, the North and the South part of the Whig Party. And so the Northern Whig Party with a few other factions came together and started the Republican Party. The Republican Party, literally, their original mission statement was to end the two practices that they called barbaric of polygamy and slavery. Of course, the first Republican president became elected, and it was Abraham Lincoln. We all know what happened. We ended up in a civil war, mainly over issues like slavery. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, the Northern Union Party, freed the slaves. Now, to do this legitimately, you had to have amendments to the Constitution. Amendment 13, 14, and 15 of the Constitution, completely pushed and backed by the Republicans and passed with the Republican support against the Democrats, freed the slaves, gave them civil rights, and gave them the right to vote. Even if you go back to the Supreme Court decision before the Civil War, that basically a 7-2 decision, they decided that slaves were property and not people. The 7 people that voted for that were Democrats. The 2 justices that voted against that were Republicans. Now, no one's doubting this. No one's arguing it. This is clear history. Everybody knows it. The first congressman, the first senators, all Republicans. Just as an aside to this, women's suffrage, the right to women to vote, was also pushed by the Republicans, even though I believe it was a Democratic president that signed it into law. It was the Republicans that pushed this. The Ku Klux Klan was founded by a Democrat. That doesn't mean it was officially sanctioned by that party. Let's be clear about that. But it was founded by a Democrat. So how did the party literally created to end slavery and behind everything positive for the African Americans in this country, how did it get to the point where 10% of blacks vote for that party today? 1929, we have the Great Depression beginning, and really through the years of the 1930s. The banks are in turmoil, the stock market crashes. In certain places, you have the Dust Bowl. It's a really, really rough time, and if you're poor, you are in rough shape. Both parties wanted to help in some way, but there became an ideological difference in how those parties were going to offer that help. And the president at that time of the Democratic Party was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, just be aware, he was not known at the beginning as someone who was really for blacks. In fact, Jesse Owens, the 4-time gold medalist Olympian, a black American, was not even invited to the White House after he won his gold medals, yet all the white athletes were. That's by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was part of that racist Democratic Party. He came out with the New Deal, basically bringing about Social Security and bringing about really the beginnings of the welfare state. The Republican Party wanted to help, and some agreed with the New Deal, but a lot of them didn't. Not because they didn't want to help people, but because they just had a different view of it. They felt like the government is taking some control away from the private citizens, and that these measures are just going a little too far. And in long term, we're going to regret doing this. It's just not really how we think we should do this. We definitely need to help, but not going this far. Now, whether you agree with that or disagree with that, or that's another podcast, that's another video. But the point is, the poor people liked it. The poor people across this country received welfare and received a lot of help from the government. Of course, the government's not just giving us money, they're taking tax money and they're diverting it to the poor. If you're poor in this country, you started voting for FDR because you liked his New Deal policies. Now, because of the systematic racism that at that time still existed, and for sure had previously, unfortunately, a big segment of that poor population was the African Americans. And so a lot of them start voting for FDR. They did not switch parties. They stayed true to their Republican Party that they'd always loved and had always had their backs. But they started voting for FDR for president. As time goes on, they start voting more and more Democratic. Truman would continue these policies. John F. Kennedy would continue these policies. And really you had about a 30-year stretch there where the Democrats pretty much controlled Congress and the presidency, with the exception of when Eisenhower was president. And during this time, they pushed these governmental programs like welfare and Social Security, and a lot of poor people started to switch over to the Democratic Party. So the first reason that blacks started to go more toward the Democrats than the Republicans had nothing to do with racism, had nothing to do with racial matters at all. It was about welfare. Now, let me say this. The Republican Party had two mission statements when they were created. In polygamy and slavery, they accomplished both of those things. And they went out of their way to even amend the Constitution 3 times to make sure that this was going to be a long-lasting success. They moved on to other things. They moved on. They have other things that they care about and they want to see happen. They have other mission statements, okay? There's a lot of people in this country, I remember growing up in the 90s, hearing Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton continually race bait. Find some little thing that happened and try desperately to get it to become this huge thing. Maybe it was a huge thing, maybe it wasn't, but everything was a huge thing because they were making money from this. Even today with Black Lives Matter, these people that are the heads of Black Lives Matter have become very wealthy by being in this position. So people like to take race and use it to make money and gain power. And the way to do that is to continue to have the problem. If racism goes away, then they're out of a job, then they're out of money. And so they want people to continue to be victims so they can continue to make money. That's the unfortunate truth of what's been happening. But the Republicans had accomplished their mission, wanted to move on. But like I said, it was more about welfare and how we're going to use government programs to help the poor and how taxes will be used. That's really what gave the Democrats votes. Now, as good as the Republicans felt about all they had done for the African Americans, people like Martin Luther King Jr. knew, in reality, guys, there's still a lot of work to be done. The job's not finished. And yes, you've changed the Constitution, and yes, you've freed us, and yes, you've done great things for us, but segregation and all this nonsense that is going on, these Jim Crow laws, have to end. We need more laws, state and federal, to put an end to this discrimination. So there was civil rights laws that came out in the 50s and 60s, and every one of these was passed. Now, this really should be a crowning achievement of our political system, in which both parties joined together. And really the only opposition was the still racist Southern white Democrats. That was really the only people that were going against these civil rights acts in the 50s and 60s. The Republicans were definitely on board with it, always had been on board with it. And the Democrats, really from the 30s to the 60s, had started to change. And you had a big section, the more probably northern Democrats, that really started to just totally change. And John F. Kennedy's a great example, someone who definitely was on board with these civil rights acts to help African Americans. Every time the Republicans are on board with it. In all honesty, the Democratic Party was becoming more and more like the Republican Party, and they had the same feeling toward African Americans and civil rights, and so actually it was a great time. Which brings us to 1964. This is the most critical date of all this. This is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. John F. Kennedy has been assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, has taken control. He is the new president. And by all accounts and by all historical context, this really wasn't something he cared a whole lot about. It was more of a Kennedy thing. But to honor Kennedy's legacy, he wanted to see it through. He championed this Civil Rights Act as well. And here's the part that no one wants to talk about. The Republicans were on board, were definitely on board with this 1964 Civil Rights Act. They had always been on board with this. So here's how the Democratic Party and Lyndon Johnson spun this story, and here's how the media portrays this story even today, is that in 1964, Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they got the Civil Rights Act passed, and Lyndon Johnson signed it. Now that's true. What I just said is true, but it's completely misleading. In the Senate, 82% of Republicans were on board with it and in favor of it and fought for it. In the Senate, there was only 68% of the Democrats that was in favor of it and fought for it. So you had a bigger percentage of Republicans that was on board with this than was the Democrats. That would be like today, Trump or Biden is in office and they're trying to get something passed, and the opposition party, 80% of them is voting for it, but their own party is only voting 68%. That sounds crazy because we're so partisan today. And in the Congress, it was very much same numbers. Now, there was a long filibuster that tried to stop this from happening. This was overwhelmingly led by those Dixiecrats, those Southern white Democrats. So, yes, Lyndon Johnson signed it. He happened to be the president. He happened to be a Democrat. But a bigger percentage of the Republicans was on board with this than was the Democrats. But from 1964 until this very day, the Democratic Party has pretty much controlled the African American vote. Now, the last part of this is Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater went on to become the nominee of the Republican Party, and he's one of the few Republicans who did not vote for it. And he cited he had issues with Title II and III. In all honesty, he was not very smart, not very bright, and he was in the wrong. And 80% of his own party wanted something, and he went against them. It is really odd that he became the nominee. So it gets spun in the media. The Republican nominee voted against it. Nixon signed it into law. The Democrats have your back. The Republicans are against you, when in reality, that's not the case. So from 1850 to 1960, over 110 years, it was the Republican Party who 100% were the ones supporting the blacks, or at least were the biggest supporter. And that never changed. They've never been racist. Like I said, because of the Great Depression and the New Deal from Franklin Roosevelt, and basically because of the difference in opinion between welfare, that's what started the blacks to start voting Democratic. And then because of the way it was spun in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, that's what got them to completely go over to that side. Now, people can vote however they want, and I'm not trying to say they did right or wrong. I'm just pointing out the fact it had nothing to do with racism, never did, and still doesn't today. So then there's this idea of the Southern strategy, okay? And I want to talk about the Southern strategy, and then I'm going to talk about two other complaints that people have when they hear videos like what I'm making now. They're going to have one of these two complaints. So the Southern strategy theory goes, look, you had a big segment of these white racist Democrats who were mad at their own party and mad at Johnson for signing this bill, and so they all decided to switch over to the Republican Party. The first part of that's true. The second part of it's not true. Yes, there was a disenfranchised voter bloc in the South that probably wasn't happy with either party, and probably more specifically wasn't happy with their own party. And let's even go further and say if you're someone going for president and you know that your opposition has a large voting bloc that's unhappy, maybe you spend a little bit more money in marketing or advertising. Maybe you have a few more campaign visits in the South than you planned on. You wouldn't mind to get those votes. But the question is, did they change their messaging? Did they try to appeal to those white racist Democrats and sympathize with them? That's the question. And there is zero proof of that. If someone listening to this can show me evidence of something that was said in a speech or in a meeting that has been documented from Richard Nixon or Reagan or Goldwater or whoever you think did this, then tell me. Like if they said, hey, we secretly support you, Southern white Democrats, and we kind of feel your plight, and we kind of have the same feelings about racism that you do. You need to come over to our side. If that was ever said, point it out. Fact is, it was never said. The best people can do is they'll imply there was code words, like when they said we're for law and order or something like that they meant, I don't really even know. But the fact is, there is no evidence that the Southern strategy had anything to do with trying to get racist people to join their cause. None. Zero. Now, is it true that from the 60s, moving on every decade, even until this very day, the South has become more and more and more conservative and Republican, and the North, East, and the West Coast, and all that has become more and more liberal and democratic? Well, yes, that is true. And here's why. After 1964, widespread systematic racism was over in this country. It's done. Even though those Jesse Jacksons and those Al Sharptons back when I was a kid, they tried to find everything possible to act like it's still going on. And even today, our liberal media looks for every story they can. I will just give you an example. Every night for the next 100 nights, a black cop could shoot a white person in legitimate police duty. The white person was a criminal and the African-American cop was just doing his job. It would never be a story. But on the 101st day, if it was a white cop who shot a black man, regardless of what was happening, it would be on the front page of the newspapers. It would be all you would see in your Twitter feed, on YouTube, and on the mainstream media. Why? Because it's a narrative. They're not concerned with a story unless it meets their narrative. But back to this topic of this video, there is no evidence that ever happened in the Republican Party. You can go back. In fact, I've done this. I went back and you can go back and read the 1972 party platform of the Republicans. You can read the 2004 party platform of the Republicans. Any year you want to go back to when the Republicans have candidates or a president and they have, elections going on, they have a party platform, and you're never going to see racism ever. Because in the year 2024, going all the way back to 1854, the Republicans have never been racist, are not racist. By the looks of it, never will be racist. It's been other issues, okay? In 1964, widespread systematic racism was over. Doesn't mean there's not racist people even today. Doesn't mean racist things haven't happened. Doesn't even mean there might not have been a racist school board member or a racist senator or something that tried to do things behind the scenes, but it never has come to fruition, and there is no widespread systematic racism in America. I can't say that enough. You've got to understand that. So after 1964, it's time to move on, right? Let's have some other missions. Let's have some other things that we're all about. Let's have some other things we're trying to accomplish. And it was in those other things that has caused people groups to shift their vote, which has caused regions, North and South, to shift their vote. Simply of myriad of reasons and views and stances that parties took, not racism. So anytime that someone on the left will hear a video like this, they're going to bring up two critiques. One's going to be, you're going to be focusing on parties when you should be focusing on ideology. The Northern Republicans back in the day were liberals, and the Southern Democrats were conservatives. And then it switched over time, the parties, but not the conservatives / liberals. There is some truth in that, but mainly not true, and I will explain. The terms right and left go all the way back. The French Revolution, where people in the right side of the royal court or legislation area were more traditional, supported the monarchy, and didn't want things to change as much. And the people on the left side of the court or the state house were more rebellious, more progressive, wanted things to change, and was less caught up in traditional things and wanted to move forward. That's where the terms come from, left and right. So yes, in that regard, the whole world, not just America, has had slavery since basically the beginning of mankind. And yes, at that time, it would have been a progressive idea to end slavery, even though Europe had already started doing it a few decades earlier. So the idea of ending slavery, yes, would have been a more progressive than traditional approach. A lot of people didn't agree with slavery, but they just kind of went along with it because it had been the norm for a long time. So in that respect, that is true. The ending slavery would have been a more progressive ideology than a conservative one. But once again, you have to realize both parties were pretty much mainly Christians back in those days, whether you were in the north, south, east, or west. And both parties were pretty much conservative capitalists, though there was differences for sure. The Democrats, especially as time went on, become more and more socialist-leaning, less capitalistic. But for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of differences in the parties as far as capitalism, conservatism, and they were all Christians. The bigger difference would have just been Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. So obviously not all of them were Christian, but most of them were. So the way we talk about conservatives and liberals today does not apply back then. So there wasn't this giant gulf of, this bipartisan where the conservatives and liberals were so different on all these aspects. No, they had some differences, mainly about slavery and things like that and the way the government should be ran, but nothing like it is today. Okay? But so that does not correlate just because in one respect of the word, it was more progressive than conservative to be against slavery has no effect on the way we are today. It just simply does not correlate. And then the other point that they're going to bring up is you should be focusing on North and South instead of Democrat and Republican. And I will agree that there could be remnants of that Democratic racist party, more so in the South today than there is in the North. I mean, they would just seem to reason, though I believe it is very few people that are racist anymore. And in all honesty, I see racism on all sides. There's as much anti-white racism as there is any other racism. And yes, over 60 years, a lot of those families do vote Republican, but used to vote Democratic. But it did not happen in 1964, and it did not happen in the 70s. It has slowly happened for 60 years. I can think back to when I was a kid. My home state of Missouri voted for Clinton both times, but has been Republican ever since. Many states have changed over time. Over the past 60 years, yes, the South has become more conservative and more Republican. But it didn't happen right after 1964. The thing you got to remember is systematic, widespread racism was over. It's time to move on to different mission statements, different issues. It's time to move on to different things. And in us parsing out our differences on other issues, whether it's welfare, taxes, social issues like abortion or marriage, or whether it's a capitalist versus socialist mindset, whether it's how we view the national debt, law and order, whatever the case, those issues have turned the country into what it is today, whether you agree or disagree. And so the South has turned one way, the North has turned a different way. Really, it's become down to the cities. It's people that live in the big cities that seem to all be leftist Democrats, and people in more rural and suburban areas are more Republicans. People that are more independent are more Republicans. People that are more dependent are more liberal. But the point here is, though many things have changed, there's been corrupt politicians that were Republican and Democrat. The party platforms have changed to a degree in some things. I think both parties at one time were more interventionist in the world as far as sending our troops abroad and in different wars and things. And at a different time, they've been more, let's hold back and stay in our own country and take care of ourselves kind of a mindset. Both parties have been through changes there. So to act like one party is not corrupt, no. Both parties have had corruption. Both parties have corrupt people. Both parties have made mistakes. Both parties have changed. But one thing has never changed, and that is the Republican Party has never been racist and is not racist to this day. The last thing I will talk about is our modern day. I will say this. One party wants to make everyone feel like they're the victim. The Democratic Party of today fights really hard to make African Americans or women or trans or whatever group that they've chosen to go after their vote feel like they're victims and feel like the more conservative Americans and the right are against them and trying to persecute them so they can get their votes. They try to control universities and the media and celebrities with pressure. They have terrible tactics that if you don't do what we say, will make you do it. They talk about packing the Supreme Court and doing all kinds of things to control. Now, to be fair, in their hearts, I believe they think, because they've been brainwashed to think, that people on the right are evil and all these terrible things. And so they think they have to go above the law and do whatever it takes to stop the right because the right is evil. In reality, the right is not evil. The right is more Christian. The right is more conservative. The right is more traditional. The right is capitalist. The right is for personal responsibility. The right is for freedom, less government, less taxes. They have never been the discrimination party, and they still aren't today. So though a lot of things have changed, that has never changed. And one, I guess the most controversial thing I'll say, I'll end it with this. The Democratic Party used to enslave blacks, and in my opinion, they're still doing it today by promoting victimhood and fear. We give you money and food if you keep voting for us, keep us in power. But you would think the end goal would be, okay, we'll do that. We'll help you. We'll support you. We'll vote for you. Help us to get out of this situation that we're in. But 50 years later, they're in the same situation. The Democrats have done nothing for African Americans. They've not helped them in any way, shape, or form, but they're kind of treating them like slaves today and still getting their votes. I would call that the Great Deception. Republican Party has never been racist and is not racist to this day. Thanks for listening. Leave your comments below. Subscribe for more content like this. Like it if you liked it. If you completely disagree with me, that's okay. Leave a comment below. We can discuss it. Hope you have a great day, and until next time, take care.